Okay, let's move into the war years. Tell me the circumstances around your father being conscripted
Yeah.
and when that would have happened.
Okay. By the time he was conscripted, I remember he had already lost his government job
Mm-hmm.
and worked for his uncle. So, 39, the day when everything began, he was conscripted, and I think Russian, the Polish
He was on the first
right there.
wave to Poland,
Yeah,
and that he ended up
in Russia.
in
Oh,
Caucasus
yeah,
near the
yeah,
oil fields, from
yeah,
what I
yeah,
understand.
yeah,
And he was there to explain exactly. Now, I've got some information
yeah.
from a relative, but what was your understanding of what it was he was doing?
He was there most of the war years,
Mm-hmm.
and he had some very positive experience, okay, with some of the Russian population there. Uh, he was a very disappointed man. He went into, of course, into Russia, being from a socialistic background. He hoped Stalin was a true socialist and he
Mm-hmm.
would see something, different
Mm-hmm.
than what he saw. And he was really shaken because Stalin was a bloodhound, just like Hitler.
Mm-hmm.
And he found this was like school buildings, auditoriums filled with bodies. They didn't have time to
Mm-hmm.
remove them. They were all the intellectuals. Stalin got rid of,
The purges.
yeah,
Yeah.
purging. And he saw that and his socialistic beliefs, and then he had to come to terms with that.
Mm-hmm.
Said, so here's Hitler and there is Stalin. What's the difference? It's a
Mm-hmm.
socialistic system. This is a dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
I think my father was never much of a church goer, but whatever there was, he lost it in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
He lost everything there of what he's seen,
Well,
of
I
what he'd
I
seen.
heard from Hugo, which is your uncle, would be
Hmm.
your aunt's husband, wrote a letter saying that what he did in Russia was that he worked at a depot where recently captured Russian goods would be distributed back to the Reich. So
Hmm.
he worked as like a manager of these depots. So
Yeah, I wouldn't
he
be
was
surprised.
fortunately out of the front lines,
Yeah, he
but
spoke the language.
so he could work as a translator as well.
Yeah, he spoke the language.
So how was it then that he ended up in France in a
Ah,
hospital? Because boy, that was good fortune for
yeah, that
him.
was good fortune for him. He was wounded.
Wounded in Russia,
Yeah,
and then they
shipped
shipped.
back first to Vienna
Hmm.
and then to France to recuperate. Okay, and it was there where the war.
So he was in a French hospital
Yeah,
recuperating, and that's when D-Day occurred.
yeah.
So he didn't have to put up a fight. He was in a
No,
hospital, so he
no.
was very, very
He was
lucky.
extremely lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
There's another story that he used to tell
Did
my
he?
father, the story about how when he saw the German soldiers. I don't know if it was German. It was the German soldiers that had been decapitated, and their heads were put around, tucked in their arms, and they were lined up on a bank,
Yeah,
as sort of an intimidation.
yeah,
Like he saw those kinds of horrible things.
yeah. Oh, he saw some.
I can't imagine. I
He
mean, the
was.
Nazis were ruthless. The Russians lost
Oh,
20 million
yeah,
people.
yeah,
The murder was
yeah.
was.
But then I don't know if he told me a story of when it sometimes in a conversation this came up. He said what one person might or might not be able to do, and this is a story I remember all my life. Was his commanding officer?
Mhm.
He was from Kaiserslautern. He father was in basic training with him. He was a theologian. He taught at the University of Freiburg
Mhm.
theology. He prepared all the seminar people in the
Mhm.
seminar, and he believed what he was teaching. Okay, so they were stationed in a small community in Russia, and I think a German soldier was shot. You
Mhm.
know, so the order came to wipe out the whole village, even the cats and dogs, whatever walks out. And that was my father belonged to the army. There was the army. So the night before, he sat with his commanding officer. They had a beer together, and he said, "I want you to give you the instruction. I trust you what to tell my family. But if I stay alive and say no, they'll be killed. And if I get killed and it's suspicious, they will also be killed. So this has to be done very carefully. I cannot do this, fill this order. How, as a theologian, And as a priest, could I go back to the University of Freiburg and teach the message of Christ to anyone?
Mm-hmm.
I can do it. So tomorrow morning, I'll walk into the battle line, fully dressed, weapons on charge, everything. You're the only one who knows.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he was killed. He did that. And the story was told to his two sons in his story by my father later on.
Oh.
Okay, yeah, yeah. But that was sort of, there were this, you heard these incidents of people were given a choice, they could not
Mm-hmm.
take the choice. This story influenced a big part of my life because this is the kind of person I admired.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So what's life must have changed in your town when the war started.
Oh, yeah.
Certainly your village wouldn't have experienced any of the
Yeah.
things until a little later, but particularly by 1940, after the Russian invasion
Yeah.
of June of 1941, what kind of things did you notice? How was it evident in your community that your country was at war at that time? That was
Well,
different than before. Were there more soldiers visible?
Yeah.
Like,
I think I have a memory. Well, no one could ignore that there was not a war because there were air raids. For instance, the air raids. They were conducted almost on a 24-hour basis. During the day, I don't know anymore who came with the English, the British, or the Americans, whoever came in the daytime. In the night, I think it was the Americans in the night, and they would of course bomb the areas around Kaiserslautern, who had big industry, chemical industry, but we were so 7 kilometers out, and we get it, you know.
mm-hmm.
And it was inevitably, and we were at war,
Mm-hmm.
and our lives were in danger. It was so serious that school was interrupted. It was dangerous for kids to go to school.
Mm-hmm.
It reached a point where people didn't want to live in their homes anymore, and someone like a mine shaft built in the mountains where we all sat. We went there. We just lived there.
Mm-hmm.
We had little Coleman type stoves
Mm-hmm.
and little lanterns and slept in there, just like rats. You know. You knew there was a war.
So they were constant. You
Yeah.
have probably memories of bombs.
And death, you know, death, I very often when I've been asked, you know, I was more familiar with a hearse than with anything else. More people I remember dying, you know. I seem to be spending a lot of time in the cemetery. Men, children, old men, you know. And
Did you personally
Oh,
witness a
yeah.
lot of death?
Oh, yeah. You know, I had a personal experience with a schoolmate of mine. We were walking to school, and it was one single airplane. I still never try, and I put it aside. Coming down, we jumped. There was a little ditch. We jumped into this ditch. My school friend wasn't fast enough. She got it, and she fell just right over me. This is the sort of thing I
Mm-hmm.
remember.
Wow.
So I knew there was a war, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So
And-
at that time, then the propaganda against the
Oh,
enemy is probably
yes.
intensified.
Yeah.
So it was a society built around fear
Yeah,
and intimidation.
yeah.
And
Oh, yeah. Then you see what I heard before and may have had some doubts. The actions, unfortunately, of this kind of air raids said he must be right. Hitler must have told us the truth.
mm-hmm.
He
It validated
always,
the
enemy,
fear.
the enemy is evil. You know.
Mm-hmm.
So you make you wonder. You
Yeah.
know.
And there were bombing raids well before D-Day.
Oh, yeah.
They were.
Yeah.
Okay. So those are some of the negative.
Yeah.
Is there anything you could say positive experience
Positive,
during
yeah,
the war?
I do. I was very active, you know, as early as 8 and 9. What did I do, you know? I helped collect clothes for people who bombed out, and food, and help with shelter. I was already there towards the helping profession, and I took that very, very serious.
Was the community very active
Yeah.
in helping each
Yeah,
other at
yeah,
least? Maybe.
helping each other.
Yeah.
If something, you know, if someone was bombed out, they took the people in. Yeah, that was.
So
they
there's a
were
real
very-
sense of community.
Mhm.
Despite the Nazi propaganda and
yeah,
everything, it was
yeah,
more just on a
yeah.
grassroots level.
Yeah.
There was one story that I'd heard, well, Jeanette and Rick had been told when they went back in 77, and the one about the mob of women that went up with their pitchforks and about the English pilot. Tell me about that.
Remember this. Okay, during some of those night raids, an aircraft was shot down. Okay, and it came down sort of in the mountain bit part. And everyone, it was just right after a raid. You can imagine some people were wounded, half dead. A lot of houses were lost. So the people came with their pitchfork and knives and you name it. That pilot, they wanted to their revenge. They were full of hate and full of revenge. And all I remember was my mother. She said, saying, "I hope he's dead. I just pray because he's the son of a mother.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I hope he is dead. I hope God, everything we serve was very spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
God is gracious and let them die before they get their hand off. They're like wild animals now because they feel they have a right. They lost so much. And I remember that very thing. And he, thank God, she got a wish. He had died. Gerlinde. He didn't have a chance to get out.
Wow.
Was a Canadian. I'll never forget that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. So now let's just quickly check the time, if you could, on your watch, just because I.
Yeah. 10 after 1?
Good.
No,
Oh,
2. 10 after
okay.
2.
Just wanted to check how much time we have left. Looks like we're okay for a while.
Okay.
Actually, I've got a readout on there anyway. Okay, so D-Day, June 6th, 1944.
Yeah.
We have the landing on the beaches.
Yeah.
And I would assume that probably by August, September of that year, your town was occupied. Tell me about.
We were one of the first ones, right? Remember close to France?
Yeah.
We were one.
Tell me what do you remember feeling?
Yeah.
Knowing as a child, you were 11 years old
Yeah.
at this time.
I
So
remember in an eerie stillness, okay, suddenly everything was quiet. There were no guns, there were no airplanes. It was so still, it scared everyone. And I remember seeing the first initial tanks rolling in with the big guns, coming in. And behind prisoners, German prisoners, in torn coats,
coming down
coming down.
Janstrasse.
Yeah, Janstrasse.
Oh, yeah.
I always remember that. And a terrifying sight, of the troops with almost cannon-like guns, on the tanks. It was absolutely, I remember that quite clearly.
But it was quiet
But I remember the quietness.
because they'd liberated these areas. Now, you must have been terrified.
Oh.
Though.
Oh,
Now tell me, your first personal contact with an American
it's
Canadian.
almost embarrassing
Okay.
because I married one later on.
Yeah.
My first contact was first of all, we had to leave our home because our home was fairly modern and they had about 10 American soldiers moved into it, and we moved next door to my cousin, on the cradle, But that was sort of the initial, and that was already scary. But I felt better because we moved into the extended family where I felt safe to begin with, so I felt okay. But there was a sweep come in, and they said we had to deliver all guns that anyone had, even BB guns. And I think we had a BB gun in the house, which my mother brought. And I never forget, it was the American in full battle uniform, and my mother handed her. And he wanted to be kind, and I screamed bloody murder. I was so terrified. And the poor guy looked so bad, I screamed like he thought he would kill me. I was terrified of him, That was my initial. And then then came sort of a little bit positive. In our house was a captain. He was Italian American. He saw us, and he felt very good about us. In particular, when he saw my mother, he started speaking in Italian. So he would supply us with food. He would personally go with. We had in the basement apples, in the basement, kept cool down in the basement. He would accompany so nothing would happen to us, so we could get our potatoes and our vegetable out.
Right.
He was very nice,
Mm.
very nice. Now that was a positive element.
Mhm.
Okay.
Do you remember, did you remember feeling odd that you were feeling that these folks were okay? That must have been a bit of a struggle, like
Yeah.
within your
Yeah, that
self.
was, But Eric, one of the things, just as I was feeling a little bit more comfortable, something, I mean, it was monstrous from where I can, thinking back what's happening. Um, we were all, remember that before the armies came in, Hitler destroyed all warehouses, food and everything. There was just what was in the fields, and that was halfway
Mm-hmm.
stolen and dug up. So we had no food. We had what Grunauer got, literally no food.
Mm-hmm.
I chewed dandelions, and in the early spring, once it got a little warmer, the vegetable came in, the fruit came in, was a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
We had nothing to eat, water, dandelions. I mean, I was starving.
Mm-hmm.
I was starving. And the Americans, next block up, had brought out like a wash tub, a big wash tub, put food in that wash tub, and poured gasoline over it,
Mm-hmm.
and set it on fire.
For the
Us-
purpose of
For us to watch that.
intimidation, you better be good or else kind of
Or
thing?
revenge, who knows?
Yeah.
Human nature. Maybe they were Jewish.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was quite devastating, Then that was brutal.
W- Were there were there atrocities? I mean, I know there weren't atrocities in the sense of murder, but was there pillaging and raping and?
That was under the Muslims. The French came in first before the French, they interchanged for a while with the French. And the
Mhm.
French brought their field troops up to Moroccans. And they were like wild animals.
Oh, you had Moroccan troops.
Yeah, for a short while.
Oh.
You couldn't, there was curfew. You could not go on the street.
Mm.
No one was too young.
Because they
or
were a
too old.
colony
Oh,
of
they were
France, so
horrible.
they would have. Yeah.
So what the French did, as long as they were there, they opened a couple of houses and put some women in who wanted to be there.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the Americans, just like that, I don't recall that much. No,
No.
personal attacks.
They probably wanted to feel safe themselves, and they didn't want to
They didn't.
intimidate you anymore.
No.
They want.
And I came to terms with that food. There were two individuals. They may have had horrible things happen to them. Who knows what they experienced? It was an act of revenge.
Now the war would have continued. I
While
mean,
I was-
probably at least another 8 months.
Oh,
It was
yeah.
April of '45 that the war ended. So you guys were occupied during
right from the
wartime
beginning, yeah.
for. So you were fortunate
Oh yeah, we were
in that
fortunate.
regard, because then the bombing of your areas
stopped.
had stopped.
And they would have I said they had loudspeakers from their vehicles, and they would always broadcast the battles. So we heard where they were now. Yeah, they're approaching this city and this city. So we know what was going on.
Right. Now, the war ends, and then you are confronted with the realities.
Oh yeah.
How was it brought to your attention of what your government had been doing? When did you tell me the circumstances behind learning that?
And my father came home,
Mm-hmm.
and he said, "You need to know the truth. You're almost big enough to go into adolescence. It's just a matter of time, and I don't want you to end up all twisted, believing in something that was brutal, murderous." And he would then tell his story. It was horrible. And then my uncles, they all came and they all told the same story
About what they saw
of what they saw.
were a lot of them in
Yeah.
Russia? And,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here.
Yeah.
Then here came out. And no, I couldn't believe that. Even my mother couldn't believe that. Dachau. What is Dachau? They couldn't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very hard battle. See, people couldn't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
They were totally caught off guard.
Mm-hmm.
In Germany, they were caught off guard. I think they weren't caught off guard when they heard some of the brutality in enemy country.
Yeah.
It was a war,
Mhm.
but in their own country. that
You
was
think a lot of
horrible.
people were just in denial, like when the Jews were taken? I mean, I've heard from so many that say they didn't want to believe
Yeah.
that they were being murdered. They just hoped
Yeah.
that they were taken
Well,
away.
Yeah, what I believe, they were discriminated so much they didn't like it, and they went away to Switzerland
Mhm.
or to England.
Right.
That was.
So, were you shown any films? Did you have to? I
Oh
heard
yes.
stories about
Oh
young
yeah.
people
Yeah.
part of the
Yeah.
denazification process.
No, that was during the time in the war, where
Oh.
we said propaganda film, and they would show us these horrible films, of Judaism,
Hmm.
sacrificing children. Can you imagine what this does to a 10-year-old?
Oh, you mean the Nazi
Yeah,
films?
the
Yeah, yeah.
Nazi films.
No, I mean more about the films of the camps
Yeah, that was
that the
something we
Americans and
saw.
Russians were filming.
Was
Did you?
I couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
The denazification became in a very interesting way for me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Explain what
Yeah.
denazification was and.
Okay. My father was very much aware of what my whole mind. I mean, I was born into the era, all I ever heard. So he said, since I don't have any particular religious preference, I'm an agnostic. We have to save a little bit on other things. It's a very expensive school, but it's the best. It's a Catholic girls' school for girls, and the teachers are international, Belgian, English. They have this exposure is there now of very high academic. They were of the Franciscan order. Okay. Their approach was total unconditional acceptance, that coming from the Belgian who may have lost a brother, and everything. Love, hope, spirituality, and they demonstrated it, I think what really shook me up was one of the sisters, sisters in French, I think, my French sister. There were rations. We were rationed food, and she had a daily bun which she would give. And one of our girls was so hungry, she gave her bun. And 10 minutes after she was so hungry, she fainted and had to be carried away. Those sort of things, it took hold of me. They shaped my life. They shaped my spirituality. They shaped me to travel into the helping profession. It's
So,
total acceptance and pointing out that what happened in Germany was not God's doing. It was the work of man. And since we all have faults, it can happen.
so you attended the school until you
Oh
graduated
yeah,
at
yeah,
18.
yeah,
So you were denazi. You were. This
yeah.
program was by
Completely, yeah.
18. You, because the
Love thy
denazification.
neighbor.
Yeah, because that program was implemented by the Allies.
Yeah.
Because they
Yeah.
recognized that the
It was
children.
part of the curriculum.
Yeah.
Okay.
It,
Yeah.
yeah. And that.
And they felt of having nuns from Belgium, nuns from France, nuns from England. Okay, that was a good. And some of these nuns had lost family members.
Yeah.
And when I saw these people giving me unconditional acceptance, something happened to me.
So, if you could reflect on those experiences from literally your birth until the age 12,
Yeah.
which you were 12 when the war ended.
Yeah.
So you were, I mean,
I
you
was
had a lot of
preteen.
memories. You were
Oh,
a
yeah.
preteen.
Oh yeah.
Eh, Tell me first the positive things that or what has helped you as a person in your experiences during the war and growing up in a
I think my
fascist state.
family, having a family, a very strong family, who were always there for me, and as long as they were there, I felt safe. Okay, and I believed in the message Hitler. I believed in it, and I worked for it. I believe he was right, so I was willing to work. I did everything that was, I would go to volunteer work, and I do that, and I go to help out in the fields as farmers, because it was everything done for the Reich was good, and everything against it was bad.
So you learned indirectly some good skills,
Yes, I
even
did.
in a,
Yeah.
in a
And they were rewarded.
Yeah.
The more perfectionism was rewarded.
so you figure that those experiences have
Gave me
influenced
strength.
your desire to get involved in the helping profession.
Yeah.
What about negative? It's probably a hard thing to identify, but
Okay. Oh, I have something
what do you think has haunted you, or
Okay,
what
okay.
what roadblocks in
Okay.
life have been a result of
You know,
your upbringing.
Yeah, I have fear what shaped your love, social justice, what we just discussing, but that and helping the, but also the negative, okay? And I thought about this very carefully. I came to the conclusion that the leftover was I had always put an exceptional high emphasis on trust, maybe too much. Maybe, trust is important, but maybe my expectation was so high that it didn't leave room for any mistakes, okay? Uh, so much so that I felt terribly betrayed when let down, terribly betrayed. Ending relationships, bang, just like that, no matter who they were, immediately without discussion.
So you
That
think
was the
that's a
negative.
legacy of,
Yeah,
of
yeah,
the state? Interesting.
definitely. That I did not quite overcome. Was quite evident this happened in my marriage, yeah, that was I think I thought about this. I was asked that question in an interview once for the counseling department, and they said it was very interesting and very head on. They were not surprised. They said it's a direct, you have to remember for you, trust meant could be death if you trust the wrong people. So
Yeah.
you were shaped by that. That was, yeah, it was a long question I thought, oh, when you have to be honest, Eric. And in this question, as honest as you can
Yeah.
be. Okay.
Now, when did you meet? How? Just tell me where you
Okay.
met Charles
Yeah.
Tolman.
Yeah. After I finished high school, my plans were to enter university. I didn't know when and how, and I wasn't quite ready. So I'd heard about the Americans were hiring people, particularly kids who had studied English, which I had by then studied some English. So I applied. There was the finance department,
Oh yes.
Ministry of Finance, and that's where I worked, and that is where Charles Tolman worked.
Okay.
Yeah,
And then later, of course, you would get married.
we
No,
met.
where did you get married? What town?
Um, well,
Was that in Erfenbach
in
or?
Erfenbach, the legal marriage in the municipal hall, in the afternoon, a blessing. Full white dress, and everything. But in Germany, the legal marriage is not in a church. Like
Okay.
I wouldn't be married like you were married in St. Luke's. That wouldn't be a legal marriage.
Right.
Okay? So, but they give blessings.
Right.
So it was the Lutheran church.
Okay, it was in the Lutheran church in
Yeah,
Erfenbach,
yeah.
and that was 1956.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you came back to the States,
In Seattle.
and you lived on an Air Force or like
Yeah, well, when your father, Charles Tolman, went back to university, and my oldest son, Eric's brother, was born, and Jeanette was born, we were eligible for what they called student housing. And student housing was a former military housing, Air
Right.
Force housing, near an Air Force base where
Right.
jet fighters took off. And we were eligible, and we moved in there,
Okay.
2-bedroom.
Now we've got about a minute left before our tape runs out. So he got a job in South Dakota from
Yeah,
there, right?
yeah, yeah.
And then it was in South Dakota where he applied for a job in
To
in Victoria.
Yeah.
And the reason for that was because it was close to Seattle, close to
Yeah,
his mother,
yeah,
correct?
Yeah.
And that was 1964.
Four. Yeah.
And that's
And my things, I wanted them out of America. I loved America, but they were too militaristic for me. I was afraid the boys would get drafted.
well, the Cold War was
Yeah,
was
yeah, yeah.
was on fire at that time.
And Charles felt the same way.
Yeah. So it was a nice compromise
Yeah.
to be close to his family, but not in America.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's it. Any last thoughts or no?
I had to think about some of the things, and it's amazing. I think I mentioned that before. It was amazing that actually it came back. That the place I worked out from the Americans was the Ministry of Finance. That I would remember that.
Right.
Uh-huh.